I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We do have a few folk who are new to the TTF with us today. So on that basis, I think it makes complete sense to briefly let everybody know a bit about the TTF. We are a very fast growing international community of individuals dedicated to trying to reform the way the financial sector works. Our mission is very clear and very specific. We're all about promoting ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And our vision is to build a highly respected, and for me those two words are very, very important, a highly respected, influential international institution that is all about making sure that consumers are treated fairly by the financial services industry. We believe that the work we do is both noble and necessary. We really don't think there's anything else quite like the TTF out there. I think we're quite unique in a number of different ways. But perhaps the most important thing is that we do not exist to represent a particular part of the financial services sector. We're not here to represent a particular faction or a particular group. We're absolutely dedicated to one stakeholder group, and that is the consumer, the ordinary member of the public. We also believe, by the way, that if ordinary members of the public are suitably supported by the industry itself can prosper and flourish. As you all know, we are talking this evening about a very important topic, all about the pension protection funds, financial fraud compensation fund, I should say, the fraud compensation fund. This is a relatively complex development, and the reason we're running the session tonight is to make sure that people who aren't that aware of it get a chance to learn more about it. We'll be hearing from speakers Sue Rivas and David Shaw from the PPF, the Pension Protection Fund. We're also going to be hearing from Sue Flood. Sue Flood is an ambassador of the Transparency Task Force and a very active member of our community. She's even on our advisory group. We'll also be hearing from Anthony Arter, the Pension Ombudsman. It's great that we've got Anthony involved, and also Guy Enright from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme as well. So we've got an absolutely great turnout of attendees, plus a first-class lineup of speakers, which I'm very, very pleased about. And thank you all, particularly the speakers, for taking time to be with us today. I'm going to invite my colleague Alexandra in a moment to introduce herself and cover off a couple of housekeeping points. There are too many people involved for it to make sense to ask all attendees to introduce themselves. So what I would encourage you all to do, and I do mean this quite literally, I'm encouraging you all to use the chat to let everybody know a little bit about yourself. As Alexandra will explain, we will be circulating the chat afterwards. Please use it to share any thoughts you have. Please use it to pose any questions you might want to put to the speakers or to other members of the community. And let's all work collaboratively to try to make this session as constructive as it possibly can be. So over to my colleague Alexandra, and I'll then be very briefly inviting Sue Rivas and David Shaw to start the speaking session. So Alexandra, over to you, please. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra. I'm the head of events at Transparency Task Force. So just to let you know, we are recording tonight's session and we'll be uploading the recording on our YouTube channel, hopefully tomorrow. But if there's anything you regret saying or you'd rather we didn't include, please let me or my colleague Tina know. I'll put our email addresses in the chat. Just let us know as soon as possible, please, so we can edit it before we upload it, hopefully tomorrow. Like Andy said, we'll be circulating the chat in a follow-up email tomorrow. So feel free to put all your contact details and any comments you want to make during the symposium in the chat. We also, if you'd like to, it'd be very helpful to us if you use Twitter, to please tweet during the symposium, anything you find interesting. I'll put our Twitter handle in the chat, and obviously I invite everyone else to do that too, just so we can get a bit of conversation going on Twitter, hopefully. And yeah, I think that's everything.
It is everything, Alexandra. Thank you very, very much. So just before I pass over to Sue and David, I'm going to share my screen and draw your attention to what is really the engine room of the Transparency Task Force, our groups. We started off with one group as a result of the symposium, our first symposium that we ran on the 7th of October 2015. That really does feel like a lifetime ago now. And bit by bit, the group has grown, the TTF has grown. We now have some 2,700 members around the world. And all of our members are organized into one or more of the groups I'm about to show you. We have groups covering a very broad range of topics. Those of you who aren't yet in the groups relevant to pension scams, we'll make sure we add you in. And those groups are the group that we have in relation to scam busters. Our scam busters group is very focused on dealing with pension scams in particular. We also have another group which we call Regulators Watch, and our Regulators Watch group is for people who really do want to help make sure that we are keeping the regulators on their toes and helping to ensure that they are true to mission in terms of focusing on protecting the consumer and all those outcomes. So here's our Scam Busters group. We meet quarterly. The next major meeting is in fact on, we meet quite frequently, typically once a month. Wednesday, March the 10th is the next Scam Busters meeting. These meetings are currently from 2 p.m. until 4 p.m. as you can see, but we are likely to be changing that to evening time. For so many people, it's better to have these events outside normal working hours if we possibly can. So that's what we're going to be doing there. So tomorrow, Alexandra will circulate the notes, and any of you that aren't yet in our Scam Busters group will be adding you in. I'm going to briefly talk about what TTF has done so far in relation to pension scams. And by the way, much of what I'm about to say has happened directly as a consequence of Sue Flood. Sue Flood, as you'll hear later, has been battling for 10 years to try to get justice in relation to her case. And I and many others have found her case so engaging and frankly so inspiring in terms of her relentless desire to carry on campaigning for reform, that Sue really has inspired me to do all I can to try to protect the interest of pension scam victims. So what we've done so far is we've campaigned for the creation of an inquiry on pension scams. We campaigned for that last summer, and we're very pleased that that inquiry was opened in September. As a result of that, there's a lot of evidence has been gathered by Parliament. Another thing we've managed to do, and again, we're very proud of this, because bear in mind, we are a not-for-profit organisation with very little resource. We really just have the power of the volunteer network that we're creating around the world. And this is the all-party parliamentary group on pension scams. Sorry, this is the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. And the one I'm about to show you now is our APPG on pension scams. And we are off the scale delighted with this. We've got a tremendous group of parliamentarians who are part of this APPG. It's chaired by Bob Blackman, the Conservative parliamentarian for Harrow East. We've got many other notable parliamentarians, including Stephen Timms himself, the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee on the APPG, and all these other folk here. I'm going to scroll down quite quickly, otherwise it will take a while. Jack Drome is significant. He's the Shadow Minister for this area, and others, as you can see, and more, as you can see as well. And also we have a tremendous volunteer support for the APPG in the form of the Secretariat. Here's our Secretariat. It includes many notable individuals. Again, I'll scroll quite quickly. Here's Sue Flood, as you can see. I'll scroll quite quickly, otherwise we'll be at this for quite a while. Mark Bishop's with us tonight, and many other members of this Secretariat are here too. So I guess what I'm saying in a roundabout way is that the Transparency Task Force really does care about the pension scams problem. We're doing all we possibly can to draw attention to the issues, to engage with the media, with politicians, with policymakers, with regulators. And really, we just want to make sure that every single opportunity that does exist to try to bring justice to pension scam victims is actually taken. I'm not saying we're doing a good job, but I am saying that we are working very hard at what we're doing. And you know, the effort could not be any greater than it is. I hope that sets the scene nicely. In terms of this evening's topic, it's a hugely important issue. We know from pension scam victims that they often find it very confusing to understand where they might be able to get compensation, redress, justice, support from. And when we got to know a little bit about the Fraud Compensation Fund, well, we figured it would make a lot of sense to reach out to the people at the PPF who actually run it, and to hope that they might be happy to spend some time telling people about the PPF's Fraud Compensation Fund. And we're really, really pleased with the reaction we got from PPF. We have Sue Reaver speaking and David Shaw as well in just a moment. We're extremely grateful to Sue and David and their colleagues behind the scenes for making this evening's session possible. So please do think of Sue and David as very, very warm guests to TTF. I'm looking forward to hearing what they're about to say. I'm sure many of you are as well. So let's invite Sue and David to take the stage, so to speak. If everybody else can make sure that you're on mute so that we minimize the background noise. Because there are so many people on tonight's session, it's going to be quite challenging to manage the Q&A session, but we'll do the best that we can. The best thing to do, if possible, is to raise your hand digitally. I'm sure most of you know enough about the way Zoom works to know how to do that. If you can't do that, don't worry, just raise your hand literally, and we'll go from there. So I see Sue's with us, I see David's with us. Please do both take yourselves off mute as David's just done, and we'll pass it over to you. We're expecting you to speak for roughly 20 minutes. It can be longer, it can be shorter. We'll then have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and we'll go from there. David, Sue, thank you very, very much indeed. Over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm David Shaw. I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy at the PPF, and as Andy said, I'm joined by my colleague Sue Reavis, who's the Director of our Scheme and Member Services. And our aim this evening is to just give you a bit of an overview of the Fraud Compensation Fund, or FCF, which is perhaps the least known aspect of the PPF's work, but one which is coming to prominence for reasons I'll touch on. I'm going to talk through the background to the fund, why it was set up, and at a high level how it works. And I'll also cover the implications of a recent court case which has clarified that certain types of scheme are eligible to claim. And I'll then hand over to Sue, who is responsible for the operation of the FCF in the PPF, and Sue will run through how we process claims, how applications can be made, and how we work with scheme trustees. And as Andy says, we've been allotted about 20 minutes of talking time, but I strongly suspect we won't need that much, and so there'll be at least 10 minutes for questions at the end. I should also say, just as any Zoom call is not complete without any internet issues, I've just had a warning to tell me I'm about to be disconnected in 10 minutes. So I think that'll give me just enough time to finish my piece. I will then reconnect and disappear briefly as I hand over to Sue. So first of all, then, some background to the Fraud Compensation Fund and how it came into being. And this goes back some time, because the FCF has its origins in the Maxwell scandal of the late 80s and the very early 90s, in which, as I'm sure most of you are all too well aware, hundreds of millions of pounds were inappropriately taken from the Mirror Group pension scheme. And this was actually one of a number of similar issues or incidents that occurred at around that time, and it led to the then Secretary of State for Social Security, as it was then, Peter Lilly, setting up a very wide-ranging investigation into the adequacy of pensions law, and that became known as the Good Report after its leading author. And that report made a wide range of very significant recommendations, but those recommendations included to establish a levy-funded system for compensating schemes who have lost funds due to fraud. And that recommendation was then given effect to in the Pension Schemes Act 1995, which introduced the Pensions Compensation Board. And the Pensions Compensation Board, or the PCP, was the first incarnation of the FCF. If you then fast forward to the Pensions Act 2004, now the Pensions Act 2004 actually abolished or amended a lot of the provisions that were put in place in the 95 Act. But one of the things the Pensions Act 2004 did was create the Pension Protection Fund, US. And at that time then, the running of the fraud scheme was made a responsibility of the newly formed board of the Pension Protection Fund. And at the same time, it was renamed the FCF, the Fraud Compensation Fund. And so in terms of the basics of the fund and how it works, it is, you know, at a high level at least, pretty straightforward. And what the legislation says is that if an occupational pension scheme has suffered a loss due to dishonesty or fraud, and its sponsoring employer has become insolvent, then it can claim on the FCF. And if the claim is deemed to be eligible, the FCF can pay full compensation for the scheme's losses, but only after any potential recoveries have been made. So that's it in a nutshell. But that said, there's probably 2 points that are really worth emphasising. Firstly, although the FCF is managed by the board of the Pension Protection Fund, the FCF is a completely distinct legal entity to the PPF itself. So in particular, the legislation is very careful to ensure that there can be no intermingling of funds or cross-subsidy between the FCF and the PPF. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly for our discussion this evening, the FCF is there to compensate schemes that have been dishonestly deprived of funds, and that goes back to its origins. It's because it's conceived as a safety net against another Maxwell, effectively, where the trustees, you know, steal the money themselves, or the trustees are colluding in a fraud, or perhaps where the trustees have an unwittingly invested scheme assets in a fraudulent investment. And that, I suppose, is a relatively narrow remit. And what it means, particularly in the context of the wider pension scams inquiry that is ongoing, and what it means is that the FCF isn't available as a compensator for individuals who have been individually scammed of their pension savings. And so probably as a result of that remit, as well as all the effort that has been made over the years to improve the quality and stewardship of pension schemes, the FCF hasn't been called upon that frequently. In fact, in the sort of 15 or 16 years now since the PPF has operated the FCF, we've only paid compensation to around 10 schemes, with a total value of about £5 million. However, and this now starts to bring us up to date, in recent years, we've been contacted by independent trustees appointed to schemes that were themselves set up, or perhaps became part of a scam. And these scams predate the introduction of pension freedoms, and it seems, I'm going to sort of generalize really, because all these scams are different, but it seems that broadly individuals were induced or effectively tricked into transferring their pension savings from a genuine scheme into an occupational pension scheme set up as a scam. And from there, the money, the assets of the scheme have disappeared. The pension regulator has appointed independent trustees to a number of such schemes, and we began to explore whether the FCF could provide compensation, was available as a route of compensation. Now, because the legislation was not established with this sort of scenario in mind, it envisaged, you know, genuine occupational pension schemes. It was not at all clear whether the FCF compensation could be available. And what we've done is worked with one set of trustees, to seek a court ruling on how the legislation should be interpreted in this scenario. And we did that under what's known as a Part 8 procedure. And the court ruled on this in November, and in that judgment said that this type of scheme, an occupational pension scheme run as part of a scam, is indeed eligible to apply for compensation to the FCF. Now, that is obviously very good news for members in such schemes. We also believe it to be the start of a relatively big step change for us in terms of the running of the fund. So we've already received around 7 claims with a potential value of over 40 million from schemes in this sort of circumstance. And if you compare that to what I referred to earlier of 10 over the past 15 years with a value of £5 million, you can see that it is an order of magnitude change, and we do expect to receive more in the coming months. So that is a relatively quick sketch of background, how in broad terms the legislation envisages the FCF working, and taking us through the sort of latest developments around the fund. And at that point, I will hand over to Sue to talk through the how we handle and process cases.
Thanks very much, David. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the operational aspects of FCF. And I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about what my team is responsible for, and then go on to talk about our plans for dealing with current and future applications to the FCF. So in terms of my team, they're responsible for devising and maintaining the processes and guidance that trustees need to follow when making an application to the FCF, working alongside those trustees to make sure they understand that guidance so the right information is provided to us as part of their application, as that will enable decisions to be made quickly and efficiently. They're also responsible for working through the evidence provided and making recommendations about whether a scheme is eligible and if compensation should be payable. They're also responsible for liaising with the other bodies involved in cases such as the Pensions Regulator, FSCS and HMRC. At the current time, we now have 9 active applications, so we've moved on from the 7 in a relatively short space of time, and they're the cases that we're working on with trustees at the moment. I can't really talk about the specifics of those, but what I can say is they represent a range of scenarios covering different levels of complexities, and that some applications are more advanced than others. And what we're expecting is that these early cases will test and shape our guidance and processes further. So in terms of processing applications, the first job for the team is to work out whether or not the scheme is actually eligible to apply. I think, as David mentioned, it has to be an occupational pension scheme, and that's what we'll be looking for to see if it is an occupational pension scheme, and also that the employer is insolvent. So effectively, there is no one to fall back on to make good any loss. Then, providing those first tests are met, we will look next at whether or not there's been an act of dishonesty which has led to a loss to the pension scheme. And if we're satisfied that there has been such an act or acts, we'll then move to understanding the value of the loss incurred. And we expect this aspect to be complex. We'll have to work through financial information and link the individual acts of dishonesty to losses. Also, as David has mentioned, we're a compensation scheme of last resort. So this means we need to be assured that trustees have taken all reasonable steps to recover any scheme assets that might still be available. So we're going to be working very closely with trustees that are pursuing recoveries just to make sure that that work represents value for money, because sometimes we suspect that going after the money they'll incur more costs than actually they'll get back. But any recoveries will be taken into account when assessing that loss. I also wanted to make clear that the FCF can compensate the scheme for expenses incurred as a result of the act of dishonesty. And examples might include the trustee costs in pursuing recoveries or legal fees associated with the court cases linked to fraud. The FCF cannot, however, pick up the costs relating to the general administration of the running of the pension scheme. We will also work closely with the FSCS to ensure that members aren't compensated twice for the same loss. But I guess in essence, what we're trying to do with the loss calculation is put the scheme back in the position they would have been in had the act of dishonesty not occurred. So once my team has all the necessary evidence and information they need, they will move to recommending whether or not a payment should be made to the trustees of the scheme. And as part of our governance requirements, a senior committee will then decide whether to accept the recommendation. If it is decided to make the payment, this will then be paid to the trustees to distribute the payments to members as appropriate. Again, as David stressed, we don't make payments to members direct, we make it to the scheme trustees. Although we're at the very early stages of considering the applications we have, we would hope that over maybe the next year to 18 months, we will be able to progress those applications through to settlement, providing, of course, that compensation is payable. We might be able to action some sooner, but as this is all very new to us, we need to make sure that we get it right. We also know that some of the investments are very complicated, as is following the money trail. So working our way through these might take a little longer while we build experience. We are, however, really conscious of the fact that members here have lost significant amounts of their pension savings. So we will be doing all we possibly can to process those applications as speedily as possible. I thought it was also worth touching briefly on future applications, because as well as looking at the applications we have, my team is also working with trustees where we haven't yet received an application, but expect to do so in the future. We think it's important that trustees understand whether the main tests are met, such as the dishonesty test, as this means that FCF provides a real option for them and their members. And it also allows trustees to communicate that message to pension scheme members. So we're talking to trustees about how they might submit evidence in stages, so we can at least provide some sort of certainty, maybe around the eligibility criteria. I guess, of course, just because a scheme is eligible, it doesn't automatically mean that compensation is payable, but it will give some certainty that the scheme is in view. We will need careful communication around that message. And I think one of the things that I would be interested in from this evening is members' views on communications and how best to keep people up to date with what's going on. So we're also working with the pensions regulator and FSCS over cases, so making sure that any appropriate information is shared, and also that we have any early warning of any new cases that might emerge. In terms of the application process itself, there's an application form on our website. Now, generally, trustees fill these in as they're most likely to have the most relevant information, although members can complete it if they want to. But if there are members who want to know whether a claim might be appropriate, I would really encourage them to talk to their pension scheme trustees, as again, they're likely to have the most up-to-date information and are likely to have considered submitting an application to us. So I guess to conclude, I hope that's been a helpful overview of how we tackle cases. I appreciate it's a bit whistle-stop. And because these type of cases are brand new to us, we are finding our way a little bit, but I would like to reiterate that we are very aware of the significant losses suffered by individuals and the enormous distress that's been caused. And as I said earlier, you have my commitment that we will do all we can to process claims as quickly as we are able once we have all the relevant information. So that was all I was going to say. So thank you for listening. Back to you, Andy.
So thank you very much indeed. And of course, David, thank you as well. That was, in my mind, a very clear set of points that helped to understand the basics of what the Fraud Compensation Fund is all about. Thank you very much indeed for taking time to share that with us. We'll go to Q&A. There are many people that have been really looking forward to tonight's session because obviously, as you'll appreciate, this topic is of huge interest to them. So I'm expecting a few questions. In fact, some of them have already been put into the chat. Sue, if I could put a couple of questions to yourself and David, first of all, just to get the ball rolling. We appreciate this is new. This is a very new and exciting and positive development. And if people happen to fall into the criteria where this is an eligible situation for them, that's potentially, potentially hugely positive news for them, which is great. Do you have a feel, Sue, for how long it's going to take before the kind of getting to know the landscape? Are we talking months here, or are we talking years? How long before things are starting to sort of settle down and that all stakeholders can understand what to expect?
Oh, I think it's a tricky one, this one. So I think what I am hoping for the cases that we actually have in the building, so to speak, that we'd be in a position to start processing them a year to 18 months. Now, it might be that for some of the more simple cases, we might be able to do things a little bit more quickly than that. And I guess what I'm trying to be is a little bit managing of expectations. Sure. The last thing that I want to do is give the impression that we're going to be able to process these claims quickly, and we can't. So that's the expectation that I'd like to set. It's probably about a year's worth of work for the applications that we have. Now, what I don't know, I mean, as people here will appreciate, there are a lot of the cases which haven't even come to us yet, have been around for a very long time, and investigations are still ongoing. So I think for me, there's something around, well, how long is it going to take for the trustees to compile the relevant evidence and pass that across to us? How many of how many cases will there be? We're not entirely sure. But all I can say is that we're working hard to get our guidance notes ready. We're talking to trustees about what needs to be provided to us, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you, Sue. That's a very clear answer. And a question for David, if I may, before we open it up to others. Is there a maximum size of the fund? Is there a point where that's it, there's no more money to pay out for compensation? Or is it potentially as large as is necessary, depending upon the eligibility of the claims? Is that a factor at all, the total amount of compensation payable?
So there's no limit on the total amount of compensation payable, and so the design of the scheme is to provide full compensation for losses after recoveries, and so that is the intent and purpose and the way the legislation is set up. It is, however, a levy funded finite fund, so this isn't dipping into general taxpayer revenue. It's set up as a discrete fund which has to be funded from a levy on other occupational pension schemes. So certainly we need to consider the management of that fund and making sure there is sufficient money available to cover all the claims over the period of time that Sue's been referring to.
Thank you, David. And final question from myself before we open it up. I imagine that for most pension scam victims, the question I'll have in their mind right now is, am I eligible or aren't I? And of course, it may not be as black and white as that. I certainly understand it. If you haven't already done so, would you be open to producing perhaps some kind of flowchart type diagram that people can work their way through that might help them understand what the key sort of decision points are, and perhaps some definitions around things like what exactly does the term occupational pension scheme mean, what exactly the sorts of things that could be embraced by the term dishonesty, something to really help people get an early feel about whether it applies to them or not could be extremely useful. Is that something you might be happy to consider putting together for folks?
Yeah, that's fine. I think we already have some information on our website, particularly in relation to what constitutes an occupational pension scheme, which ones are eligible, which ones aren't. But we can certainly look at widening the information that we have on there, certainly.
Thank you, Sue. That's just great. Again, Sue, David, thank you very much. Let's open it up now. So I'm going to change my view setting to gallery so I can see folks. So please raise your hand. I think we've got a hand is up already from Mr. Mike Stafford. Mike was the speaker at one of our events last week. He did a great job. So Mike, really pleased to see you're back with us today. Please do take yourself off mute, Mike, and put your point to Sue and David. Thank you. You're still on mute, Mike. You're still on mute, Mike. No. Bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you'll see the microphone icon. There we go. Perfect. Over to you. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Sue and David. Two very good presentations. I have two questions for Sue, please, if I may. The first one is, could you give us some examples of what is considered to be dishonesty? And the second question relates to recoveries. You say that the fund will pay out after recoveries. I'm gathering there that the impression is that the trustees are responsible for collecting recoveries. And if so, do they get any help in this, or is it just left to the secretary of the trustees to write to the dishonest party and ask for money? How does that work? Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll have to write down what you said because I'll forget. So I think your first question was, could I give you some examples of acts of dishonesty?
Yes.
So I guess wrongful investment of assets, inappropriate investment of assets for the pension scheme, putting them into a liquid assets, just being wrong, excessive charges, inappropriate charges, inappropriate administration, just neglect of how you run a pension scheme, loans that are paid to employers that exceed 50% of the value of the pension scheme. So there's a kind of whole suite of things that constitute dishonesty.
Sue, I would say all of those describe incompetence, not dishonesty. Maybe some of our legal brethren here tonight will make a comment on that. That just seems like incompetence. It's honest. Okay.
No, some of them are things. There's so, for example, the point about loans to employers. That's statutory. There's things that you're not allowed to do. So and what we will be looking at, it can't just be incompetence. It has to be dishonest in its intent.
Right.
Okay.
Sorry, I've now forgotten what your second question was. I knew I should have written it down.
Do the trustees get any form of assistance in seeking recoveries?
Interesting question, I think, this one. So we haven't seen a great deal of, because we haven't been doing this for very long, we haven't had a great deal of experience of it. But what we can see is that trustees are doing quite a good job of following the money trail, if you like. Some trustees, I believe, are calling on others who are more expert in the field of tracking down that money. So they do call on that. And I think what we'll be looking at is whether or not there's any help that us as an organisation or indeed the pensions regulator can bring to bear if necessary.
Thank you. Is it assumed that the guilty party is a company or an individual?
What do you mean by?
Well, when they're focusing their on their recoveries, are they going after the person who made the dishonest transaction in your eyes, or their employer?
I mean, I'm assuming that they're going, to be perfectly honest, I mean, I'm not close enough to these sorts of things quite yet, but I will be, I assure you. But I think what they would be doing is going after the company or the individual, depending on who has actually perpetrated the fraud. I mean, we can see that some are set up as investment companies, that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know if there are any trustees in the room who might be able to answer that question better than I can.
Okay, thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Mike. But by all means, if there are any trustees with us that would like to comment on the conversation we just had, please do let us know. Just wave your hand. In the meantime, I'll invite anybody else to make a point or put a question to Sue and David. Please do wave your hand. We go to Jeremy Cornford, who's raised his hand digitally. So, Jeremy, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
I'm just, by the way, I'm a finance advisor who's got a couple of acquaintances who are victims of the ARC pension scheme scandal. I just wanted to ask Sue, in the case of the ARC, it was shut down and then a few months later went to the High Court where they declared it a void, i.e. fraudulent scheme. Would the fact that the High Court has deemed it a void scheme, a fraudulent scheme, be enough to warrant that to be recognised, therefore, as a dishonest scheme?
I'm imagining so. I mean, we haven't had the application in, so
no.
But I'm imagining if the High Court has said that what happened there has effectively rendered everything nil and void, and it has to go back to the position that it would have been in at the start, then I'm imagining that that's likely to pass the dishonesty test.
Okay. And you're saying that at this time, probably due to it's a burgeoning thing that's obviously going to be happening as we go, almost like a movable feast already. And that they're taking, by your estimation, it's going to be a sort of year, 18 months lead-in time from beginning to end. Is there going to be any sort of scope for increasing your staffing levels with what is almost certainly going to be a fair avalanche of applications once people are made more aware of this scheme?
Yes. So, I have a very small team at the moment, but we are now about to. Well, we started recruiting
right.
on the basis that we think there are going to be more cases coming our way.
Right.
So we will be able to. I mean, that's part of the point about, you know, we're trying to bed things in at the moment, try to understand what we need to do. My assessment of it taking a year to 18 months, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be true as a lead-in for all cases.
No.
But until, you know, in all honesty, until my team gets some experience under our belts, we can't really say how long these things are going to take. I mean, if we get great evidence come in, then we might be able to race through them. I mean,
yes, indeed. Here's hoping. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
That was a very helpful exchange of thoughts there. Thank you, Sue. Dennis Waite. Dennis has been a member of TTF for quite a long time, and he's been battling away vigilantly with others to try to get justice for his own situation and that of others in his scheme. Dennis, please do feel free to put your question or make your point to Sue and David. Thank you.
Good evening. I was just wondering if the scheme I'm in is deemed as qualifies for compensation. Any payments to HMRC, seeing as the scheme was an HMRC registered scheme in the first place, if it's deemed as fraudulent and we do get compensation, any payments made to HMRC, would they be returned as well? Because they said that it was an
unauthorized payment.
Yeah.
I think this is one of those areas where it's quite tricky, but if a member has paid out, then in theory, yes, we can compensate for that. I mean, the tricky part is this point again about we're meant to be compensating the pension scheme, not the individual. So we just need to work through exactly how we're going to kind of manage that. But
Right.
in theory, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's good to know. That's really good to know. Thank you. A few folks have put questions into the chat, which I'll ask you to put in person now, if you don't mind. We'll go to Mark Cleary, then Spencer Lynch, then Peter O'Donnell, then Bob Ward. So, Mark, can you please put your question to?
Hi everybody.
Thank you.
A number of questions actually. The first one was related to how generally does the FCF be notified of applicable schemes, and the second point is, having just been on the website, fraud generally has no limitation in law. So I'm interested to know why there's only a maximum of 12 months from notification or suspicion or the finding out of such activity taking place to register with the FCF.
Sorry, what was David? Can you pick up the second question? I don't know if you know the answer to that one. The first one is, did you say how do we get notified?
Yeah, generally speaking, how is the FCF notified of such schemes?
I think we get them from a kind of range of places, really. So we might get a member contacting us, we might get trustees, we might get the pensions regulator, we might get FSCS. So it's kind of a range, really. And then what we ask is that an application form is completed so that we can work out whether or not people are eligible.
Okay.
David, I don't know if you know the second question, do you?
So on the second point, this is an application needs to be made. Is it within 12 months of
12
employer
months.
insolvency? Is that?
Is the one,
I mean,
two, three.
generally fraud has no limitation, but from the website it states that upon identification of such activity, there is only a 12-month period to apply for to the FCF.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's what the legislation says, and we follow it. So the policy intent for that, is the Department for Work and Pensions responsibility. My guess is it's about giving us prompt notification to engage, to recover, and ensure recovery action happens while there is still time, and that's what's driving that 12-month period. I mean, Sue may want to comment on this point as well, but I think with the claims that we're already aware of so far, that has not proved a problem or a barrier to a claim proceeding.
That's good to know too.
Generally speaking, that could be countered through a court, surely. I'm not a lawyer, but that suggests to me that if it is legislation, that somebody can potentially judicially review the decision-making process involved in that.
I guess it depends why, really, because as David said, at the moment we haven't had, of the applications we've had, they've been within that 12-month period. And we've got provision to, I think we've got a discretion to accept the application in certain circumstances if it goes over the 12 months.
Okay, well, I mean, my background is financial services and claims, in particular, more over the last 10 years, claims management activities. And until I received an email from the Transparency Task Force the other day, I hadn't ever heard of the fraud compensation scheme. So it seems to me that, it's not a very well known thing in either financial services or the claims management space. So I think if it becomes more widely known as a result of things like this happening this evening, then there may well be people who have suffered through these activities and not known where to, you know, and obviously they're going to be time barred from approaching the FCF.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
It's an interesting point. I think this links into what Sue was saying earlier, Mark, about the communication side of this, because this is essentially something which is quite new, quite fresh. And the more scheme members who've been scam victims and the more trustees who get to know about this and take prompt action, the better. And that's what led to the conversations between us and the good folk at PPF to have this session tonight. And it might be that we try to do more. Sue and David, has the PPF or the FCF kind of written to all trustees to say there is this thing called the Fraud Compensation Fund, and in some circumstances it might do X, Y, Z? Has there been kind of a systematic outreach project of that kind to make sure that at least there's been a genuine attempt to make everybody aware? Because it would be heartbreak on top of heartbreak if there were scam victims who actually would have qualified but didn't get compensation because the trustees didn't take action in time, etc. I'm sure you know the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about there.
If I can just interject briefly, one of the things that I picked up in the earlier part of this conversation is that trustees themselves could be implicitly involved in, you know, the nefarious activities. So, yeah, I understand the point about trustees, you know, contacting, and from the website there are other professionals involved in these schemes, for example, in accountants and maybe insolvency practitioners et al. That would potentially be aware of this. It just seems to me that, well, do not many people know about the FCF because there have not been up until now that many instances for the fund to have been used.
It's kind of just getting off the ground, really. I think that's a fair way of describing the sort of stage that the FCF is at. Mark, I think you've made some points which we'll definitely be keen to follow up on, and maybe Sue and David and all their colleagues might be happy to kind of return in 6 months and have a follow-up session just to sort of show how things are moving forward. We would certainly welcome that, because I'm sure that you and others like you, Mark, would appreciate it. Thanks for your points, Mark.
Okay,
let's go. You're most welcome. We'll go straight to Mr. Peter O'Donnell. Let's go to Peter. Peter, over to you, please. Introduce yourself briefly and then put your point to Sue and David. Thank you.
Peter O'Donnell. I'm a director of a law firm that's involved helping insolvency practitioners and victims of regulated company director misdemeanor. I can't believe that there is a time limit on this. It's unbelievable. I'd be the first one to put money on the line to take a judicial review against that decision. I can't imagine anything more unfair in my life. The Financial Ombudsman Service is bad enough with its interpretation of limitations. And limitations is something that has to be tested in court. Probably they'd put it there just in case, because all the cases I know go back 10, 15 years. And if no one knew about it, this hadn't even been created then. So I'm just absolutely flabbergasted. But what I'd like to know is, what's a trustee? I'm not into this trustee world. Who was the trustee? So what happens with these companies is some criminal starts a company, and then he starts an occupational pension scheme, registers with HMRC, and then he cons people to join that who don't work for the company, but believe that if they transfer their occupational pension to that company, that they'll get better returns on their investment. Then that person invests the money into Tel Aviv car parks, which he owns, but in a different name offshore. Then he resigns from the company and resigns as the occupational pension scheme operator. Who's the trustee? Because he can be the trustee. I know you can have an accountant as a trustee, but I'm confused. Where are the trustees? Who are the trustees?
So it might be worth. I think it's an important point which has come up in quite a few instances. So the trustees we are engaged with and are notifying us are not the trustees who were present when the fraud was perpetrated or the act of dishonesty was perpetrated. They are They are independent trustees who have been appointed by the pensions regulator to the scheme once the fraud came to light, once the TPR became aware of it. So that's the trustees that we are referring to, who are notifying us and taking the claims forward with us in these circumstances.
What if a trustee was never appointed?
Well, if a trustee isn't appointed, I mean, others, as Sue was saying, others can make an application to the FCF, but if there needs to, in an occupational pension scheme, there does need to be somebody running the scheme, acting as the trustee, and so in those circumstances, we would expect the regulator to take steps to make sure a trustee is there and in control of the scheme. And it might just be worth saying on the time limit point, it's 12 minutes, 12 minutes, 12. That would be 12 months. 12 months from the trustee or other associate professional being reasonably aware. So in that circumstances, I think we would read that as being the independent trustee being appointed, identifying the fraud and contacting us, rather than the original. Yeah.
I think you're going to be tested heavily on that.
Well, I think the other thing, if you didn't
know there was a scheme, could you report anything?
If you didn't know there was an FCF, well, I think any independent trustee appointed by the regulator would be very much aware of us and the FCF. And I think the other point to make that Sue did make is that there is a discretion available to the board on that time limit as well, which obviously, in view of the November court, would there be, as a number of you have very clearly pointed out, a clear onus on us to operate that discretion entirely reasonably.
If you look at the company Fast Pensions, I mean, everyone's heard of Fast Pensions, I hope. I think they had 100 schemes, and they had 660 clients. I initiated having the Fast Pensions insolvency moved from the official receiver Liverpool, Manchester, to Quantuma in Southampton. We've been trying to contact the clients, but Del Riada, who's I know made an announcement on this last week, is refusing to allow us to contact the clients, because the trouble is I don't know who's taking responsibility for contacting the clients. We have a few already, and they'd be desperate to know this information.
Any thoughts on that, David or Sue, before we move on?
What do you mean on the communication point?
Yeah. I guess the question is who's actually responsible for making sure that those who could have a legitimate claim against the fund are made aware of that possibility? Who's responsible for that?
Well, I think again, there's an obligation on us, I think, to make sure that we publicise FCF. As David has said, most of the trustees have been appointed to schemes where fraudulent activity looks to have been perpetrated, or already know of the fact that we're in existence. But I guess what we can do is just try and work with groups like yours to figure out what is the kind of best communication to put out there, because in some ways there's no point sending information to trustees, because there are loads, there are thousands and thousands of schemes and trustees which are kind of bona fide pension schemes. So how do we tap into the groups that have been affected? So I think it's just trying to work that out, really. But we're happy to have any conversations around that.
Well, let's see what we can do, because if we can all find a way of working collaboratively to make everyone aware of this very positive development, then that would be a good thing to do. We'll follow up on that. Peter, thank you for putting such interesting points across there. Let's now go to Mr. Bob Ward. Bob, like Peter's been around TTF for quite some time, very knowledgeable guy. Bob, please bring the point that you put into the chat to life for us. Then after Bob, we'll see if there's anybody else that's itching to ask a question. Then we'll go to Sue Flood, and then we're going to go to Anthony Arter then to Guy Enright. So, Mr. Bob Ward, please introduce yourself and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. It's best way to explain the question actually is to give you an example. Fraudulent withdrawals and pension schemes are quite often indirect. In other words, they involve the transfer from an ongoing final salary scheme. Now, let's take, for instance, a couple of examples I've come across where they've come from the services or NHS. Now, in both those cases, the original money has come from a still solvent scheme. It's gone into an occupational pension scheme, which has turned out to be fraudulently created, and then the funds have disappeared one way or the other. The current trustees have been appointed, so there's statutory trustees in place. I know one's on the call actually listening as well, so fully aware of what my question implication will be. Well, if they actually apply to you on behalf of the members to reinstate the funds from that scheme that people have left, their target point basically must be the transfer value received from the original scheme. Whereas from the members' point of view, if they were looking for a full restitution, they would prefer being reinstated to the original scheme. And that cost may be entirely different to the current DC value of the scheme that was lost in the fraudulent scheme. So which scheme are we talking about? And how does it get back? Where we've got statutory trustees involved now, they're interested in recovering the monies for that scheme. But if a member said, well, really, I want to go back into that final salary scheme, and TPR had the mechanism to actually create that, who actually then would go back to, say, the NHS and say, you need to make a claim for this person because he was fraudulently encouraged to transfer out of your scheme. That's where the original fraud took place. Whereas, you know, what you're talking about at the moment is actually getting funds back into the receiving scheme. So which one are we talking about? And how does the mechanism work on it?
So, I mean, you articulate the sort of scope of the FCF exactly right. It's the receiving scheme that is eligible for the fraud compensation fund compensation. So the FCF would compensate for fraudulent or dishonest loss to the assets of that scheme. What the FCF doesn't do is look to put the individual member back into the position they would have been before that transfer. So the FCF is very much focused, and this is sort of what I was saying about the narrow remit and the basis for the FCF is focused on compensating a scheme that has been dishonestly deprived of funds.
Yeah,
Thank you,
but you're talking basically that there are two dishonest transactions here. One is from the receiving scheme and one is from the original scheme.
Yeah.
But in terms of your remit, you said that the original employer has to be insolvent. Well, clearly the NHS isn't. So you know that may prohibit that going back, but certainly we're not getting full restitution for the members.
So just to clarify on that employer insolvency, it's the employer attached to the receiving scheme rather than the transferring scheme, which has to be insolvent. Yeah.
Thank you. It's occurring to me as we're having these questions and answers and this discussion, it's occurring to me that there might be some real value in a group of TTF volunteers to be our kind of FCF liaison, people who are quite knowledgeable, who might help FCFs consider some of the issues that perhaps it hasn't considered yet. We can follow up about that idea, but please do let me know, folks. I'll put a question in the chat you can respond to. Let me know if you might be happy to be a TTF sort of liaison with the FCF, if you think that you might be able to bring some useful technical insights and experience. That could be quite handy, I think. Of course, that's subject to Sue and David and others at FCF thinking there's any value in that. John Spain's got his hand up. John, lovely to have you with us. It's been a while, sir. Please do put your point to Sue and David. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm trying to put on video, but
don't worry.
Yes.
We can hear you. We can't see you well. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. It's good to be here. This idea of compensating the scheme loss is a bit elusive, because in fact, if the scheme has paid out the cash equivalent, there has been no loss to the scheme. There is only a loss to the member whose assets have been improperly transferred. Could that be revisited, please? It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
So the scenario that the FCF is particularly focused on is where there has been a transfer, a CETV from a proper scheme into this scheme, which is part of a scam, and it's that scheme which is part of a scam where that cash from the transfer then gets fraudulently removed and disappears from that scheme, and it's in respect of that loss that the FCF pays compensation. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, David. Let's go to the wider group to see if there are any other questions before we move over to Sue Flood. I think that might be it. I've got a couple of pages of faces looking at me, so I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss any. Peter O'Donnell, is that a new hand that you've put up there? I'm not sure if it is or not. It is, yeah. Go for it, Peter. Thank you.
What I'm worried about is that if you have to take necessary action against any other forms of compensation, one of those is necessarily acting against the seeding provider for allowing the transfer. Now, that's an extremely hard thing to do. And will the scheme, will the fund require that before looking at, and that's an individual thing. So you might have 100 people in a fraudulent scheme, all coming from different seeding providers, and they really should, according to what I know, take action against the seeding provider for not giving due warning to say you really shouldn't be making this transfer.
So I guess the question for us in that sort of scenario is to consider, you know, as Sue and I have both described, the FCF is there as a fund of last resort. So after other recoveries have been made, that's not an absolute rule. I think the way it's written is, you know, reasonable chances of recovery from other sources have been exhausted. So there is a question about whether there are other sources of restitution from the transferring schemes that is a good one. Although I think in our in some of the initial schemes, and again, all of this is very much at the beginning, we think it unlikely that we would require that avenue to be exhausted, because it's far from clear cut that, for example, you know, appropriate warnings haven't been given, for example.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, that's been a particularly helpful session, I thought. I really do hope that everyone's appreciated the chance to hear directly from Sue and David about the Fraud Compensation Fund and how it works. We're going to move on now in a moment to Sue Flood, who, as well as explaining her own case, might have a few questions of her own as well to put to Sue and David. So please do stay with us. After Sue, we've got Anthony Arter, the Pensions Ombudsman, and then we've got Guy Enright from the FSCS, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. We've worked really hard tonight to bring key stakeholders to the discussion. I hope you all find that useful. The very next thing, of course, that I'd like us all to do, please, as enthusiastically as you can muster, is to simply show our appreciation to Sue and David for the session this evening. It's been very, very good indeed. And hopefully this will be the first of a few sessions like this. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. And I did put a note in the chat. Let me know if you'd like to volunteer to be part of this group, that we would like, if possible, to have some kind of ongoing dialogue with Sue and David and her colleagues. I generally think that the kind of technical, challenging, knowledgeable questions that this community has could be quite useful. It might just bring to the surface issues and dimensions to these topics that haven't already been dealt with. And of course, we can talk about the key theme that Sue mentioned to us, which is that, how do we make the communication around this effective? That's going to be the most important thing to be done in the short term. Sue and David, that was absolutely great. Please do stay with us. I'm now going to pass over to Sue Flood, who will spend a few moments talking about her own case and her experience in recent years, and may have a few questions of her own as well. So Sue, please introduce yourself and go from there. Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you.
Good evening to all of the bodies that are on. Sue and David, thank you very much. I have already offered my services to the Pension Protection Fund, specifically with my experience over the years, so that is in there should they wish to take that offer up. Thank you to the PPF, because victims now have a glimmer of hope that someone will give the victims of pension scams a fair hearing. As we've heard earlier in the call, the High Court ruling provided in November 2020 confirmed that the FCF can now consider the applications for compensation of pension scam losses, which have been piling up, I should imagine, these last 4 or 5 years. It's now hoped that the criteria and the process to be set out will not take too much longer, as many of the victims are now in their 60s and 70 years of age and in financial ruin, mostly in financial ruin. Some of you on this call will already have heard my story. Apologies if you've got to hear it all again. I'll try to keep it as succinct and as short as possible. So I'll summarise briefly my story to assist our guests in considering my comments and a few questions at the end in going forward. In early 2011, myself and my partner decided to transfer our deferred pensions with a low to medium risk appetite to a UK regulated investment. This decision was taken following a financial review, which was undertaken by an extremely well-known financial entity regulated in the UK by the FCA. Well, it was then the FSA, but they provided financial and pension advice. At this time, this took place, we were living temporarily in Spain, but our main home was in England and we were UK based. The IFA initially suggested that we transfer our funds into a Curops, which we couldn't do because we hadn't been out of the country sufficiently to accept that offer, but we declined and SIPs were also discussed. Ultimately, our funds were transferred by a tick box exercise from Standard Life in my partner's case and the BBC in mine into DC occupational schemes that were registered with HMRC and the TPR. We were not aware that this had happened, nor that the employers of these schemes had not long been registered at Companies House and were not trading. Nevertheless, UK trust bank accounts were set up by the scammers to ensure that our pension monies went into accounts that they could control. The majority of our pension monies were then invested into unregulated investments abroad and one in the UK, with extortionate fees and commissions paid to the various people handling the transaction process. The pension regulator, on being alerted to the scam by HMRC, who already knew about this in August 2010, met with those perpetrators, scammers, in February 2011 and used their powers HMRC did to appoint a professional trustee to schemes, which we refer to as ARC, which was in May 2011. I confirm that as our pension monies were being transferred, I had concerns prior to Dalriada trustees, and I tried to get the pension monies returned to the seeding schemes and instructed UK lawyers to assist. I reported the matter to Action Fraud, the pension regulator, the FCA, the police, and the Serious Fraud Office. It's now been 10 years since my money, my partner's money was transferred. The individuals and entities responsible for providing the regulated financial and pension advice are still operating. No action from any of the regulatory bodies appears to have taken place against them, and they continue to earn monies. Myself and other victims of pension scams in all of this time have had no victim support to assist in dealing with the trauma and the significant financial losses of our pension scam. None of the regulatory bodies mentioned thus far have provided any constructive help to assist us in trying to get our monies returned. HMRC appear to have concentrated all of their efforts over the last 10 years, issuing penalty fines against the professional trustees and any pension scam victims, chasing rolled up interest on those rolled up interest on those very victims who have lodged appeals. Actually, they just added 20k to mine, and I can expect that every year because I'm going for an appeal process. So my advisor now tells me the stress, the sheer night terrors, the family breakdowns, the whole situation really cannot be felt by anybody other than another victim. We are victims of fraud and scams, and HMRC, after 10 years, have still not resolved the matter by going to court and the tax tribunal with all of these victims. So the torture for us all still continues, and the appointed trustees still have to drag on with HMRC dragging them on too. That's my story. I'm open to any questions with regards to that. Couple of questions I'd like to ask you, Sue, if at all possible. HMRC are treating the monies that left the scam schemes as being unauthorised payments and are levying hefty penalty fines against the current scheme trustees and the individual members. Does this suffice as part of the criteria for schemes to be eligible for the FCF?
So I think on the point about whether or not sorry, can I just be clear about your question? Are you saying the unauthorised payment and scheme sanction charges, is that part? Would we? Yes. So we would class that as part of the loss. So if you've had if you've lost a percentage due to paying out to HMRC, then yes, in theory, the FCF can compensate for that. But a bit of what I was saying before, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to work through at the moment, because it's that interplay between the individual and the scheme. Because as FCF, what we're meant to do is compensate the loss to the scheme, not necessarily the loss to the individual. But we also want to work, I mean, we are aware of the issues going on with HMRC, and we're trying to have some meaningful dialogue with them as well. Yeah. So
that's brilliant, Sue. I mean, that's amazing. I'm sure the other victims on this call will fully understand what it means to constantly get those brown envelopes through the door and to constantly be fearful on a daily basis of, it's extremely difficult to put into words. So it's good to hear that this criteria might be eligible for the FCF. Going back, and I may have misunderstood you, and I apologise in advance if I have, 18 months to 12 years on possible compensation. In particular, the ARC victims are still waiting for the tax tribunals and HMRC are still arguing the CFC argument, and therefore they're not going to be in a position, Dalriada trustees, to be able to come to the compensation scheme and be effectively looked at, because they haven't got the full depth in their way, because one, they don't know about the scheme sanction charge that's still dragging on, and two, the victims don't know if the tax is being levied against them as well, or this tax amnesty that's in place with Margaret Snowdon will have been dragged across the line. So for the victims of ARC and a few others, they're still being dragged along fundamentally by HMRC, not you guys, because you're trying your best to help these victims, which is absolutely amazing. One last question to you. I am aware of other pension scam victims. I have a full regulated, I've actually got loads here on my wall, of regulated scams that have taken place since 2010 to date, which show patterns of dishonesty throughout. I'd like to offer that to you at some point to discuss with you guys, because I think establishing a pattern of dishonesty, there was somebody on the call earlier, forgotten the gentleman's name, that would help in showing the same names, the same pattern of dishonesty, and it's not just a one-off. I think the gentleman called it bad administration. It's certainly not, it's career criminal. So going back to what I was trying to say, I'm aware of other pension scam victims that the TPR and the courts have not appointed professional trustees. Please can the FCF ensure, when setting out the criteria and process, as to how these individuals may also be considered, so that nobody is left behind or forgotten. And then lastly, your website is not updated to reflect the ruling, in case I missed it, of November 2020. Application forms and guidance may help if that could be forthcoming. And if yes, when's the likely timescale? And as I said, I have offered whatever I can do to try to assist you guys.
Yeah. I mean, the point about where there are no trustees on a scheme, we can take applications direct from members, and if there isn't, you know, what we can do also, I think, as David mentioned, we do need trustees on the schemes to run them, so we can talk to the regulator about if there are such cases where there aren't any independent trustees. We can talk to the regulator about getting them appointed. So,
that's amazing.
Just let us know a bit more information.
Well, I can provide you with my phone number, and thank you from the bottom of our heart to the PPF for helping the victims. It's the first time that that has been forthcoming from any regulatory body in over 10 years, and it's amazing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, for once again having the courage to talk about your own case, which is it's shocking, isn't it, that even now you haven't yet had sort of peace on it, and you can't yet have closure on it. Sue and David, I hope you see the very genuine appreciation here from this community for what you're doing, not just in terms of being here tonight talking to us, but also the idea that there could be a fund that can help people, because these are people that do, in my personal opinion, do deserve help. Wayne Stevens is with us, I think, tonight. I mentioned Wayne because if Wayne is with us, it would be great for Wayne to introduce himself. Wayne's with Victim Support, and we've had a couple of brilliant conversations in recent weeks around the role of victim support and what victim support might be able to do to help in various different ways. Wayne, if you are with us, please do take yourself off mute and just say hello to everybody. And if you wish to, share any thoughts you have before we then move on to Anthony Arter at the Pensions Ombudsman Service. Wayne, are you here?
I am indeed, Andy. Thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Wayne Stevens. I work for Victim Support, which some of you may know is a national charity. We provide practical help and emotional support to people who experience all sorts of crime. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is an increase in people who've experienced fraud coming to us. We are not fraud specialists. We can't advise people around their rights and entitlements. I mean, I think the presentations this evening and the feedback from some very knowledgeable and experienced people here show what a complex and technical field just the pensions fraud area is. So we aren't specialists in fraud by any means. It is something that a lot of our staff and volunteers have got experience of. And I guess what stands out for me, and Sue expressed this really well, is the personal impacts of being defrauded by whatever means it is. And we can and we do provide a safe space for people to talk about what's happened, to unpack their feelings and the impacts. We've got some tools and resources that help people to work through some of those emotional traumas that people experience, with a focus on the individual to help you find the ways that you can best cope and recover from what's happened. So an example would be the initial trauma of someone who's experienced a fraud, and I'm thinking of someone, they were telephoned by someone pretending to be from British Telecom, but they were a scammer working from outside the UK, and they persuaded this person to transfer a significant amount of money from their savings account. And that person was absolutely terrified. She didn't want to tell her husband what had happened. She did tell the bank so that she was able to safeguard the accounts, but she was fearful about reporting to the police. She was having sleepless nights. She stopped eating. She was off sick from work. And obviously our service can't do anything about recovering the sum, but we did give her somewhere where she could work through some of those feelings and find the courage and the strength to be able to share it with her husband. So I'd say do look us up. I'll drop our website details in the chat. And if you think it might be a useful service, have a look at what we do and what we don't do, and also our geographical coverage, and we'd be happy to talk to you. And more importantly, to listen.
Thank you very much indeed, Wayne. Just a personal comment from me. I found the recent conversations TTF have been having with victim support to have been remarkably helpful and remarkably supportive. You can tell straight away you're talking to people who care, who want to do what they can, and I think that's half the battle. Sometimes pension scam victims in particular feel like nobody cares, and they go round and round in circles, getting passed from pillar to post. And in some cases, like Sue, you know, literally have been doing this for 10 years. I'm going to share my screen once again before we go to Anthony. Here's the all-party parliamentary group on pension scams, which you can tell, you know, TTF is very proud to have helped get this up and running. And the reason I'm showing it is because, oh, excuse me, wrong page, is because we have a resources page. And the idea of the resources page of this website is for it to become a, if you like, a font of all knowledge, a place where everything and anything that could be useful to pension scam victims goes. And it's been dealt with by a volunteer. We've got no money, so we have to find nice people to help us. And Mark Ormston, one of the TTF volunteers, has taken responsibility for this. What you're looking at right now is the 50 Ways to Lose Your Pension song by the guys at Money Alive. Ian Beeston's a drummer there. He's a very active TTF member. And you'll see we've got victim support here. If you click on that link, it takes you into victim support's resources. And we've got more on the way coming from victim support, just to kind of evidence that we're trying to do what we can to make the route for victims to support less tortuous than it has been in the past for some people. Okay, well, David and Sue, once again, thank you very much. Sue Flood, thank you very much as well. Really pleased that we have Anthony Arter here. Some of you may already know that Anthony Arter is the Pensions Ombudsman. Again, Anthony and I had a very constructive conversation not that long ago, and I'm extremely grateful to Anthony for spending some of his Monday evening talking to us about his work and the work of the Pensions Ombudsman Service. Anthony, please do take yourself off mute and spend 5-10 minutes or so just telling everybody a bit about yourself and the work that you do. Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, that's good.
Yep.
Okay, well, I've got some slides, but I know we're talking about pension scams tonight, so I'm going to whip through those slides about the powers I have and how we work, and then so if I'm going too fast and you want to ask any questions afterwards, then please do, because I'm not going to spend much time on those slides at all. But can you put those slides up, Andy, and I'll whip through and then get on to pension scams. Okay, right, everyone. Well, I was appointed the Pensions Ombudsman in 2015, and I'm just going to run through the changes made and also the powers that we have. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So we can investigate all occupational and personal pension schemes, as you can see there, and also some decisions of the PPF as well. We're impartial, customer focused, and free alternative to the courts. There's no charges for our service. Next slide, please. So we deal with things that obviously predominantly concern administration and the management of occupational and personal pension schemes. The Financial Ombudsman Service provides advice in respect of sales and marketing of individual pension arrangements. So it's unlimited redress, which is unique because it's completely unlimited. I can put someone back into the position that they were in, provided obviously that I find that they have a case which is proven to me beyond reasonable doubt and within my powers. Funded from the general levy, and as I said, these decisions are legally binding. I can only be overturned if I get the law wrong, not on my opinion on the balance of probabilities. Next slide, please. So I welcome the dispute resolution team, which I personally asked the Minister for that transfer in March 18. It was actually in 2016 that I put my paper into DWP suggesting that the service be merged with mine. This is in terms of the 240 volunteers that mediate and try and resolve complaints, often before going through an IDRP, an internal dispute resolution process for that particular scheme. I had an MOU agreed between DWP and also the regulator that we could take those cases pre-IDRP, pre the internal dispute resolution procedure. It's outside my actual powers to do that. So I had to have the MOU that I could actually manage that process. Money and Advice Pension Service took PensionWise and gave it in, and that the original APAS, I'll say it right in a minute, I can muddle myself now. Pensions Advisory Service used to give that service, that went to the Money and Pensions Advisory Service, now Money and Pensions Service. So I took all the pension related disputes that charity dealt with, which was set up in 1980s. The pensions were set up in the 1990s. So there was an overlap, which I resolved. So DWP launched a public consultation in order to change the powers that I have, because I'm acting outside of my powers in that I now resolve 95% of all disputes by informal resolution instead of a determination. Legislation dictates that anyone who comes to me with a complaint which I accept can have a determination by me. But this is a slow, long process, and I wanted to speed that process up where agreement could be reached between the parties. The consultation back to that change, I'm yet to have the legislation put in place, but hopefully in due course it will be. But in the meantime, with consent of both parties, 95% are resolved by mediation. Next slide, please. I can also make awards for distress and inconvenience. These are non-financial injustice awards. For distress, as you can see there, concern, anxiety, anger, disappointment, inconvenience, the time and effort spent by an applicant in relation to the bad administration and having to pursue their complaint. Next slide, please. So I also have the power to hold oral hearings. Now that's really important. It's very resource intensive and I don't have many resources, but in a case of scams, I will hold an oral hearing. If I'm considering actually holding the individuals responsible, and I need to hear the individual who's been scammed under oath on what he or she did and how it occurred, but also the trustees or the administrators of the scheme as well. I'll talk about some of those cases in a moment. I also will hold an oral hearing if the trustees exercise their discretion, which I consider as perverse. I will ask the trustees to reconsider the matter, and if on reconsideration there is no change or they haven't gone through the process properly, I will hold an oral hearing, and I may decide actually to overrule the trustees and exercise the discretion myself. In pension liberation cases, you can see from the slide, although it may not involve dishonesty by the party complained about, indeed, if the redress is ordered, I will ensure there's no double recovery. So if there are monies left in a particular scheme which are repaid, then the individual who's lost money won't get the monies back twice. They will just get the monies that they lost plus interest. Next slide, please. Now, the first case I'm going to talk about is Mr. N, Northumbria Police Authority. This was a case in 2018 where Mr. N was working part-time for Northumbria Police, and he decided that he wanted to actually get a better rate of interest or better return from the scheme. And so he went online, and he was contacted, as many of these individuals are, and persuaded that actually there's an occupational scheme which would give him a far better return than the police scheme, the safe occupational police scheme in Northumbria. So he applied to transfer his pension arrangement of $112,000. The occupational scheme, which he didn't really know anything about pensions really, is based in London. Northumbria Police only had a particular year in which he transferred, which was in 2014. They only had 5 cases where they had transfers. 4 of those cases were actually inter-police force transfers, which is quite normal when police officer transfers between different police forces. His scheme, of course, was out of the Northumbria scheme, so the London Quantum DC Occupational Pension Scheme, and the sole sponsoring employer was Quantum Investment Solutions Limited. That went into liquidation. Northumbria Police didn't question why he would be joining an occupational pension scheme in London when he's based in Northumbria. And if you know anything about police service, then they have to get permission to actually work somewhere else. And if it's in London, you'd have thought Northumbria Police would question this and wonder what was going on. They didn't actually speak to him direct at all. They didn't give him the Scorpion leaflet, and they didn't go through a proper process. At the oral hearing, I said to the representatives of the police service what they'd done about the leaflet, the Scorpion leaflet, and they said it was on the intranet. So they had their laptops with them, so I asked them to find it. They couldn't find it. So as far as I was concerned, they hadn't gone through a proper process. And also, Mr. N convinced me that he wasn't aware of scams at all, and he thought the whole matter was genuine. I was convinced by him, and I decided that he should be transferred back into the Northumbria Police Authority, into their pension scheme, with no loss to the individual. That was accepted. That wasn't appealed by Northumbria Police. That was a satisfactory outcome for that individual scam victim. Now, the other 2 cases are different. The first one, the Henry Davison Limited case, involved a Mr. Anthony Davison. Henry Davison was his father, who considered himself to be an investment expert. He was rather foolish. He invested his own money and lost his own money, but he persuaded other people to join the Henry Davison scheme. He actually was involved with a couple of people who subsequently were arrested and convicted of fraud. But he believed they were innocent. He believed they were perfectly, they were just idiots themselves, and it was unfortunate they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, quite incredible, really. This was someone who was a partner at Rothschild's and had a lot of other investment experience through his years. He invested in one arrangement, which was fraudulent, but they were able to rescue some monies from that before it disappeared. And he persuaded those individuals to invest in another investment in Switzerland, and 1.5 million of members' monies, 14 members, were invested in this arrangement in Switzerland. He had total control over the investments. He didn't go through any proper processes which a regulator determines that one should go through as a trustee. And he lied to the individuals about their return, where they showed an increase in their return every year. In fact, the monies were disappearing. And of course, what's common in all these cases is extremely high charges were being taken, including to another company which Anthony Davison owned. All the money disappeared. I held Mr. Davison and also his wife totally responsible to repay those monies to the members. That I can do on the balance of probability, not on a criminal prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. That's important. Now, the second case I'm going to mention, I took another step forward to try and deal with these cases. I had 31 complainants regarding the Norton Motorcycle Pension Scheme. Stuart Garner bought the name, the brand Norton, from Americans in 2008. Famous motorcycle brand. And he himself was a motorcyclist, and he was very keen to actually revamp Norton and make a lot of money. He was short of funds on doing this. The government backed him and paid government monies to help him set up. But he also set up 3 pension schemes, and he persuaded the members to transfer their monies and invest in Norton. 14 million, or around about 14 million pounds in total, over 300 members. I had 31 applicants, and by the way, of course, Norton then went into receivership. I had 31 applicants, but because we got Dalriada as an independent trustee appointed by the regulator, I joined Dalriada as a complainant. And I again held an oral hearing. Unfortunately, this particular oral hearing, Mr. Garner was doorstepped by ITN the night before, and so didn't appear. He said he was too frightened to come to my oral hearing, although I did provide security for him because of obviously some very irate members. Again, I'm sure that many of you got sad stories to tell, and some of the stories that I heard on the Norton case were very sad. There was a woman that lost her home. There was another chap who had muscular dystrophy, no monies. There was a daughter of her father trying to get monies out of the scheme before he died. Again, no monies forthcoming. There were many, many very sad stories. Anyway, ultimately, I held Stuart Garner personally liable to repay the 14 million and also to pay distress and inconvenience awards of £6,000 per member. And that was for all the membership of the scheme, not just the 31 applicants. And that's the change that I made here. He appealed, Stuart Garner, to the High Court. His appeal was turned down in part. They allowed the appeal against the distress and inconvenience award I made because he argued, well, I say they allowed the appeal, they haven't heard the appeal, they allowed the case to go ahead on appeal on the 6,000 that I awarded, saying that I didn't consider every single member's personal situation on whether some were less stressed than others. That may come back to me as a result of that when I'll reconsider the 6,000 for each of those members. But on the main part of repaying the 14 million, the appeal was turned down. He then, and I should say that the Norton brand has now been bought by an Indian company. He then had an oral hearing to appeal against the appeal that was turned down. And at that hearing, the judge said, okay, because this business about paying twice, what Garner said was that if at the end of the process of the bankruptcy hearing, monies come from the Indians that can be repaid to the members, then he shouldn't have to pay those monies. So the judge said he'll hear the argument on that point, but he said it's a bit like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. So in other words, he won't be getting out of actually having to pay what he needs to pay to ensure that the members get recompense for their loss. That's a very important case. And I've got a number of other cases very similar to that now, because I'm taking this line, that if there are monies available by the individuals that have taken that trust and taken those monies, then I will pursue them. And I had another oral hearing just before our third lockdown, where this individual did appear. I can't go into it all because it's still going through the process of a provisional decision and determination, so I can't give all the details. But this individual, it's quite interesting. He said that, in fact, he was an introducer for about a dozen schemes, which were all scams, of course. And then they decided to set up a scheme themselves. And then he tried to convince me that this scheme was a genuine scheme. But of course, all the money's gone and disappeared. He was taking 35% of the transferred monies for introducing. And for the scam that he set up, the scheme that he set up, the more monies have gone, he's taking 50%. It is absolutely appalling. And I've only got limited resource, but these cases, if there's a chance of getting monies back from trust from these individuals who set up these schemes, then I will take that action. Any questions?
Anthony, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights and your experience here. I remember being very impressed with you when we spoke a couple of months ago, when I just started to understand, frankly, how unusually powerful the Pensions Ombudsman Service is, and how hopefully it might become a route to market or a route to justice, I should say, for some of the scam victims that are within our community. Let's open it up for questions. That was great, Anthony. It's superb to hear your resilience and your tenacity in chasing down the baddies, because not only could you potentially get compensation for the people they've scammed so far, you would very actively dissuade them from carrying on doing it. And we think that's part of the problem. We think part of the problem is that the scammers just carry on because they don't see any risk in doing what they do, because they're not being properly chased down. So I think the work that you and your team are doing is absolutely vital. It really is. Please wave your hand at me, folks, if you'd like to put a question to Anthony. We've got a race between Francisca and Mike. Let's go to ladies first. Francisca, please briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Mike. Thank you, Francisca.
I was just waiting to say thank you for a wonderful presentation and all the rest. That was all I was doing.
Okay, that's very good. In which case, let's go straight to Mr. Mike Stafford. Mike, your point, please. Thank you.
Well done, Anthony. It's very, very impressive. I assume by 95% of your cases are resolved by informal resolution. Presumably, nothing is publicised thereafter. I, as a regulated individual, are one of the many who contribute to the Pension Compensation Fund, as you will appreciate. And part of our frustration is when a claim results in a payment from the compensation fund, we don't know who has actually committed the crime. Nobody tells us. And it's all very well making the claim to the client who's been conned, but the problem for us is, and for others like us, is that the people who are doing this are still putting themselves out there, and when somebody is looking to employ a new advisor, they don't know the people who are the scammers. Is there any way or anything within your power, or is it maybe something for the compensation scheme, to publicize the people who have committed these crimes so everybody can see who they are, as individuals, not companies now?
Mike, I probably didn't make myself clear. When I talk about 95% of cases, I'm not talking about scam cases. I'm talking about general complaints where there's an administrative error or an overpayment, underpayment, all these sorts of errors that occur with pensions, not scams. Scams, scams come to me. Scams are determined. Scams are not dealt with by an agreement between the scammers paying some money across. And funny you should say that, because I had one the other day where these individuals are trying to come to an agreement with the individuals who complained, offering a payment. But of course, that's only one individual who's complained. They know full well they've scammed other people. So they can pay one person off that's complained to me. They can get away with it in terms of the rest of the scheme. I won't allow that, Mike. I'm not a fool. I'm not going to be, you know, hoodwinked by an individual like that who's just trying to stay under the radar. And I'll also report them to the regulator as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Anthony. Let's go to anybody else that would like to put a point or put a question or make a point. Mr. Paul Sheridan, please briefly introduce yourself, Paul, then make your point. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Sheridan, and thank you, Anthony. That was really very, very interesting. Question I have for you is, in a situation where you have somebody who has been, it revolves around the phrase advice, because, you know, advice is a regulated setup. But what happens, because I heard you mention about introducers, and particularly the introducer who is an introducer for about a dozen schemes. So how do you trace the liability? Because the guy that I'm trying to help at the moment, he was in a bank scheme. He was advised, he wasn't advised, he was introduced by his introducer friend to a SIP business. And it's a murky trail. It involves about 27 different companies, while the pension fund washed its way halfway around the world and apparently now is gone entirely. But it's really difficult to figure out who is the person or persons that need to be pursued in this. So I'm starting with the introducer who was unauthorized, unregulated, and just sees himself as being, here's a way where you can transfer your money, your pension pot out of that bank and into somewhere else where, as the phrase goes, I'll get you a much better rate of interest or a better return.
The person that I had the oral hearing against wasn't in respect of him introducing other schemes. It was in respect of the scheme that he set up. I can deal with the complaint in respect of the scheme that's set up. I haven't got the powers to go on, you know, to a person that's just telephoned someone and arranged for them to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, I'd like that power, but I haven't got it, Paul. Yep. And the only people that can really take that sort of action are the police, the fraud squad, etc., etc. I haven't got general powers to do that. Yeah. You know, I've got a lot of power, but unfortunately I haven't got that power. And I can understand the frustration. It is frustrating because there seem to be quite a tight group of people who are involved with this, who know each other. That's the impression I'm getting. Yep. And if you can actually investigate and have the power to, which the police have got, of course, have the power to actually trace that through, then you may get somewhere. But I can understand your frustration, Paul. I really can, and also the frustration of individuals who, you know, perfectly innocent, who believe someone, who are very convincing. They have tremendous convincing skills, and persuade people to part with their money.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's going to be worse, of course, as we go through the recession, which people don't realize yet. We haven't really hit recession yet. 21, 22, I really feel this is when it's going to get very tough because people will be desperate for money.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Anthony. Time for one more. Has anybody would like to ask a question that hasn't yet had a chance to do so? We'll go to Stan. I know that your question, Stan, is going to be in relation to tax, so it's not going to be that relevant for this particular session. So I'm going to sidestep your questions, Stan, and I'm going to go to John Spain. John, your hand's up again. If we can see you, John, this time, that would be good. If not, just feel free to fire away.
I don't know why it is so dark.
It looks rather ghostly, John, but anyway, don't worry.
Well, yeah. Two things, if I may, but both quick. First of all, if you, Anthony, can report the names of the scammers to pensions regulator, can they also be shared with Inland Revenue, HMRC, so that these individuals can be stopped from setting up what used to be called approved schemes, registered pension scheme?
Well, I've always got to be, we've got to be so careful now. I mean, we often have hands tied behind our back, don't we, in terms of passing information to other agencies. You know, even the regulator, I have to, you know, be very careful if they're investigating a matter, how much can they tell us, how much can I tell them? It's crazy, really, because I think, you know, we want to break through these barriers where the only person that gains out of it actually is the criminal, is the fraudster. For me, I will share. Obviously, I'll publish names. If I make a determination, I will publish the names which are readable. I can, but make a point then of actually sending it through to HMRC. I haven't done that before, but that might be a good idea, John.
Yeah.
With regard to other information, until I make a determination, until I determine that someone has actually committed a wrong, I've got to be very careful how much information I provide.
Sure. On that note, and that's a cracking idea, John. It would be lovely to see if Anthony's able to pick up on that informing HMRC point. We need to move on. Can I please invite everybody to join me in thanking Anthony for what was clearly a very, very compelling and very, very interesting session. Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. Bravo, bravo. Appreciate that, Anthony. As this session's been evolving, I've been saying to myself, wouldn't it be great if, let's say, in 6 months' time, we could have Anthony back and Sue Rivas back and David Shaw back, and also our next speaker, Guy Enright. Guy, please do take yourself off mute, introduce yourself. I think we're going to be finishing at roughly 8:15, folks, so we don't need to rush this. It's great that we've got Guy here from the Financial Services Consumer Scheme. This topic of pension scams is of enormous interest to the FSCS, as it is to all the rest of us. Guy, please say hello and tell us what's front of mind for you when it comes to issues around pension scams. Thank you, Guy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Andy, and good evening to everybody. I've been listening with great interest, and I think a number of the points that I was intending to cover have maybe been made elsewhere, so I may be slightly briefer on those. For those of you who don't know, the FSCS is a sort of financial services-wide compensation scheme that was set up through the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. We're funded by levies on the industry. I think we're probably best known to the public for the sort of £85,000 protection that exists on bank accounts in mainly banks and building societies. That's now actually really not that large a part of what we actually do in terms of paying compensation. We're in a very different place to where we were immediately after the 2008 financial crisis, when we had borrowed low tens of billions of pounds from the government to cover the compensation cost of that time. That's now all been paid back to the government with interest. But when I looked in preparing for this at what our levies were in the last financial year that we'd reported on, which is 2019-20, the levies totaled £551 million, of which 162 went for the cost of general insurance failures, 101 million for investment provision, but 262 million for the pension and investment intermediation classes. So that's really now sort of half of what our costs are that is going in this sort of scam, whether it's people investing through a pension or making an investment through another vehicle, maybe an ISA or some other investment vehicle. I think self-invested personal pensions and probably QROPs within that have risen very significantly for us in recent years, to the extent that we were paying out 161 million on those claims in 2019-20. So it's a problem that we're keen to see something done about, because I think our most recent publication, our chief executive statement said, look, this just can't go on like this. It's not right that consumers are suffering this detriment. It's not right that the levy is falling on the industry at this level. And this really shouldn't be going on in the way that it is. What we're seeing in the pension space is claims related to both defined benefit and defined contribution transfers. So we've seen, I think probably one of the higher profile cases we've seen in the last couple of years has been people persuaded to transfer out of the British Steel pension scheme. It seemed that there was sort of a flock of dubious independent financial advisors who descended on those workers, and at a time when they were being offered options to transfer out of the scheme, because I think British Steel was being sold and a realignment of how the final salary scheme worked was a necessary part of getting that sale away and making sure that the business continued to operate. People were preyed on with unsuitable advice, and often ended up transferring out of the British Steel scheme into SIPs, where they were being subjected to very high ongoing costs, and the advice was totally unsuitable. They're difficult things for us to deal with because not everyone who gets poor advice to transfer out will immediately realise that that advice is poor. I think a number of people have said earlier on this evening that these are often very convincing people, and if you're not necessarily financially sophisticated, it can be very difficult to realise that something's gone wrong until some way down the line. So I suspect that those will be cases that will continue to trouble us cost-wise for some time to come as people become increasingly aware of what's happened to them. There's also a lot of defined contribution schemes where people have got pension pots that they've built up with employers, that I think in more traditional times they'd have stayed in a basket of diversified investments, reducing the risk of those investments as people got nearer to retirement, and historically people would have bought an annuity with it. And I think this is probably to a point that Anthony was making earlier. We've been in a financial environment now for a long time where investment returns are very low. The Bank of England base rate dropped below 1% in March 2009, and it hasn't come above that level since. And I think we are seeing a lot of cases where people are offered unregulated investments, which are offering maybe a return of 8% or thereabouts, which seems to be the sweet spot at which consumers get attracted into those products. And it is putting us in an awkward position because the way that FSCS is set up, we only cover regulated financial services that is provided by firms regulated by the FCA. And if you're in an unregulated investment, that is not of itself something that we can cover, but where we may be able to help out is on the issue of regulated advice that has put you there. So generally for a pension transfer, people will have had an IFA involved at some point in the process. And if that IFA is still in business, then hopefully you can go through the financial ombudsman and get some redress that way. But frankly, if they have been serial offenders, if you like, giving out poor advice, then the weight of claims that falls on them often makes them fail, and then those claims will fall to us to be dealt with. But yeah, it is very difficult, and there are a lot of people out there who are not necessarily putting money into these things through pensions vehicles and maybe doing so outside the regulated environment, and they are very sadly left high and dry by what has happened in some of these cases. Pensions advice claims, I mean, another issue is that the limit is now in line with the deposit limit at £85,000. But that may well not cover the amount that people are transferring in pension pots. Our hands are slightly tied on that in that we don't set the limit for what we can cover. But you would hope that it would cover many people, and it at least gives people something. But I am very alive to the fact that there will be people left with uncompensated losses, which is pretty unsatisfactory. I mean, I also had to think about in advance of this year the sort of things that we see people being put into as investments, and if people are being advised to invest and often putting all of their eggs into one basket with potentially a holiday property to generate investment income, or bonds issued by property developers, be they holiday resorts or residential developments. We're seeing people buying plots of agricultural land in the UK on the promise that it will get planning permission for residential development and rocket in value. We're seeing car park spaces sold. I think they've been mentioned earlier. We've seen schemes in the UK and in Dubai which often seem to fall into some problem with the income just doesn't come through to generate the return that people are promised. We've seen renewable energy investment schemes which fail, and a variety of sort of farming and forestry schemes where people are putting money in either to generate an annual crop or to put into a longer term investment that might mature about the time of their retirement, when these trees in wherever they might be are felled. And yet the common theme, unfortunately, and it's in the nature of what FSCS does as an organisation, all the investments we see are the ones which go wrong. And there are, in some cases, legitimate reasons for those investments underperforming, and certainly the pandemic over the last year hasn't helped. You know, if you're running a holiday resort or an airport car park, it's been a terrible year for you without a doubt. But we're seeing a wider number of things failing than just that. And you know, it is something that we look to get money back from the schemes where we can. We do liaise with other authorities, and particularly, I think, you know, we've gone public on some of what we've done around phoenixing, where people are setting up one scheme, watching it fail, and then popping up again in another guise. And you know, we do report on that where we see wrongdoing. I think we probably, as an organisation, actually have access to quite a lot of information about what is going wrong across a fairly broad range of investments because of the nature of our remit. So hopefully it's helpful that we can do that, and you know, we would certainly be supportive of other organisations taking action to clamp down on this sort of thing, because it's far better, to my mind anyway, if the loss doesn't happen in the first place. I think I'll stop there and invite any questions, if that's all right.
Guy, thank you. Before we go to questions, may I first of all thank you very much indeed, Guy, for sharing those thoughts with us. I can see that Mike Stafford and also Mark Bishop would like to make a comment, and we'll go there in just a moment. I just want to share with you, Guy, one, and everybody else, one particular point, which is that I watched with great interest the recent hearing by of the Treasury Select Committee with the chairman and the chief exec of the FCA. And one of the points that came out of that, and I'm making sure I don't overstate the point, one of the points that came out of that was that it seemed to me as though Nikhil Rathi, the new chief exec of the FCA, he seemed to accept the idea that the FCA has been a bit reluctant to prosecute. I think he made the point that in the past, the FCA has tended to be a bit reluctant to litigate, or only wanting to kind of prosecute when there was, you know, great certainty that there was a case to be won. And I think it would be a good idea if the FCA was a bit more bold in taking cases to court, because whether they win the case or not, it sends a message out there that you know, a scammer is going to be chased if they do something wrong. I think that's a very important point. And I was also delighted when the chairman, Charles Randell, made the point that he effectively said that the FCA could and should be doing more to deal with prevention rather than cure. And I'm sure that chimes with your thoughts, Guy, that the more the regulators do to actually stop scams from happening in the first place, the less mess and carnage there is to deal with later on down the road. Any sort of comments on that, Guy, before we move to Mike Stafford and Mark Bishop and anybody else that would like to make a point?
Yeah, no, I think there's a valid point. So, I mean, I think trying to take action to prevent claims arising is one of the four pillars of our current strategy. I think we're very much alive to the fact that if we can do more to help prevent, that is a good thing. I should say, I mean, I'm sure most people know, but we are a separate organisation from the FCA.
Yes.
Whilst we are accountable to them and we liaise with them sort of fairly regularly, what they do in terms of enforcement action is unfortunately not within our gift. But yeah, as a personal view, I would be pleased to see a few more bad actors getting chased down for what they're doing.
For sure. Thank you, Guy. Thank you. Let's go to Mark Bishop. It's the first time we've heard from Mark this evening. And Mark, for those of you that don't know, has been wonderfully involved and supportive of TTF in the last 6 months or so, helping in particular with various consultation responses. But by the way, folks, in today's Transparency Times, we put out a request. TTF will be responding to the FCA's consultation on duty of care. And if you want to get involved with that, then just respond to my duty of care question in the chat. Mark, please make your point to Guy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question for Guy, but it's also a question for his colleagues at the FCF and the Pensions Ombudsman, if they would be willing to very briefly answer as well. And it's this, it's about quantum of redress. So particularly in the case of a pension scheme, there is a CETV sum that transfers into what turns out to be a scam. The scam operates for a number of years. The scam closes down. There are minimal recoveries typically from that scam, and there is a shortfall. How do you determine what you are prepared to pay or reward, according to which organisation it is? Is it the difference between the CETV and the kind of pittance that comes back from the insolvency, or is it the sum that's needed to put the person in the situation they would have been in had they not been scammed? Because obviously they're very different, because, you know, often there has been lost returns in the meantime, and the question is who meets those costs, that shortfall?
Thank you, Mark. I can answer half of that question with confidence, and the other half I'm going to caveat by saying that I'm not desperately close to our claims assessment processes. But what we would look to do is essentially to put you back in the position that you would have been in, save that, of course, we don't have any power to reinstate people into final salary schemes. So we would only ever be able to award a lump sum. What I think we would be looking to do is to say, well, what was the scheme worth when you transferred out of it? And that sounds like, I'm not a great expert on pension valuations either, but it sounds like CETV, because that would be presumably what you would get if you transferred out into a scheme that wasn't a scam, and that would be the right amount. We would then look at what the value was of what you'd got, you know, in the assets that you transferred into. And quite often for those assets, we make a determination that the asset is of sufficiently uncertain value that we should treat it as nil for the purposes of the claims calculation. Because I think it's not right that, you know, if there is an asset, there's, I don't know, a couple of villas in Greece or something that are going to go through some sales process, but it's going to take 5 years to work out what comes back to you. I don't think it's right that you're expected to sit there and wait for that process to play out. So we would say, please assign us your rights in the underlying assets, and we will place them at nil value for your claim and proceed on that basis.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Mark. Let's go to Mr. Mike Stafford again.
Yes, thanks, Andy. Good evening, guys. I enjoyed that very much. If you were listening earlier to my questions to Anthony, you probably know what I'm going to ask you. Every successful claim against the compensation scheme has the name of the individual who created that missale. Why are we not told who these people are? And if there is the power that within your remit to publicize these names, why don't you let them out to the industry? We need to keep these guys off the street, so to speak. We don't know who they are, and in your own words, they may be serial offenders there. Why do we not know about this?
I'm wondering if there may be more we can do, but I suspect that part of the answer is around data protection. And if somebody has genuinely been negligent in a one-off way, and they're not an offender, for want of a better word, but they've just made a genuine error in the competence of what they're doing, and they've missed something, I think it would be wrong for us to tar them with the same brush as someone who is a bad actor. and potentially defamatory. So I think we probably need to be on reasonably firm ground before we go out and start naming people publicly. But that is not to say that there may not be more we could do. Can I take that away and think about it?
Yes, please. Even if you're just to start at, say, a minimum of 5 cases. If somebody has committed 5 cases, it's not accidental, is it?
Probably not, no.
Yeah. We need to know who these guys are, because the problem is for employing advisory firms that these guys are coming along looking for jobs and nobody knows their history. Nobody knows what they did elsewhere. And the firm gets the bad name because it's the firm's name that's publicized as the claimee, so to speak, not the individual.
Yeah, and it's then not actually giving you the opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to employ you because you've been involved in all sorts of problems in the past. Oh yeah, let me think about it. I do seem to remember a case, it's going back a number of years now, where someone managed to successfully sue for defamation over an employment reference, which is why employment references all tend to be so brief these days.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy.
A very, very useful exchange of thoughts there. Would anybody else like to put something to Guy before we begin the process of bringing today's, what I thought to be a very, very informative session, to a close? Any hands going up anywhere? I think we're all good. I think we're all good then. Can we please thank Guy Enright from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme for that very, very helpful session. Folks, I will be doing all I can to invite Guy back, and Sue from earlier, and David from the Fraud Compensation Fund, and of course Anthony Arter, the Pensions Ombudsman. Maybe we could have a catch up in 6, 7, 8 months time. I think this would be a really good forum to exchange thoughts and ideas. I will leave the channel open for about 10 minutes or so, a sort of final informal exchange of comments and questions amongst us, but I'll formally bring things to a close now. I just want to once again thank our speakers, Sue Rivas, David Shaw, Anthony Arter, Sue Flood, Guy Enright, and all of you who've attended tonight, and of course those of you who've kindly stepped forward with comments and questions. I really do hope it's been useful to you. We always try hard to do things that have the potential to make a difference, and without a doubt, just knowing what on earth is going on in the system is actually in itself quite useful. Well done all the speakers, thank you very much indeed. We'll wrap it up there, but I will keep the channel open in case any of you want to chit chat very informally afterwards. I think Francisca's got a hand up, and also Bob Ward, or are you just waving? I think you're waving. Yeah,
no, I'm not waving this time. I just wanted to say I actually did send you an email and a message about it, but I've come across a sort of couple who've become millionaires who are trying to offer educational presentations more for younger generation, I would suggest, but I want to get my children enrolled with them. And secondly, I've seen something else about, very far reaching, about positive money and changing the system, because at the moment it's rewarding people who've got money at the expense of the people who are poorer. That's
Yeah. Thank you. I get that.
I'm just waving bye-bye.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Cheerio. Well done, folks. Thanks a lot. Good night.